Good afternoon, everyone. I see a small attendance. I think I shouldn't have put SIEM on the title, because probably that scared half of the people that will be eventually interested in hearing about that. But why would we be here talking about SIEM? Right? First, probably comes to my DNA in talking about SIEM. I used to work for Gartner, writing a lot on security operations, especially SIEM. I'm guilty about writing a lot of stuff together with that guy over there, Anton Shvakin, on that topic. And just kind of a type of technology that I really love to look at, not only from the technology point of view, but Anton knows a lot about that. I also fascinated about how people use it, right? Kind of how, and try to understand a lot about why some organizations will have success with a solution, with a tool like that, while others fail miserably. And not only that, people that are working on that tool hate that so much that they try everything else later. They go to Nepal and start meditating, and they gave up on life because of the SIEM experiences that they have. So why there's so much difference in the experiences that people have with this type of solution? So looking a bit more about the SIEM, right? Like it or not, it is a common tool in our arsenal, right? It is the foundation for many security operations teams out there. We may start talking about XDR, whatever that is. We may see people that are just will fall in love with EDR and not use anything beyond that. There are those that just going to tell you the truth is only on the network. If it's there, we're going to traverse the network, so it should be NDR and nothing else. Yes, we're going to hear a lot about those different opinions in terms of tools. But the truth is, the SIEM is in the majority of security operations centers out there, and is usually a central piece of what they are doing. It normally it is a central point of the operations that organization can have in place. Not only it is something that is there as a central piece, but it has been around for a very long time. Right? I'm saying here 20 years, but we can certainly say 30. Some of the older names in this space may have a little more than 30 years old. So they're really some very archaic technologies there, some newer, some very recent. So it is something that has been around for a very long time, right? From old traditional relational databases to now based on cloud, big data technologies. Of course, technology has evolved a lot, but it has been around for a long time. So we should be able to extract some lessons for this type of technology. There's also the question about, okay, it is there, but it is something that will eventually go away. Well, not necessarily, right? We look into a survey that was done by Thought Labs and that we participated, and one of the questions that they asked to thousands of CISOs out there was, what are your top technology investments for the next 2 years? The two top answers for that question was on identity and access management technologies and SIEM. So you see, not only it is already there, used by many organizations, but there are also organizations that are putting more money on this thing. So if it's going to be around, we actually got to try to make some value of it, right? And try to understand a bit more about how to use in an efficient manner. Now, what should you really know, right? What should you really do to try to understand more about how to use a SIEM, right? One of the first questions when you decide to buy the tool, what data are going to feed into the SIEM? Right? It is a technology that can ingest practically any data. Right? Of course, you're going to see most of the times firewall logs, operating system logs, but it can ingest almost anything. Almost any SIEM out there will have the ability to create custom parsers, custom ingestors, whatever they call it, connectors, and also custom rules in a way that you can ingest any type of data. So what data should we feed into this technology? Now, there is also the thing about the logic that the SIEM will use to generate alerts or to try to find something. It may be simple rules, right? If you see these certain conditions in the events that are being ingested, alert. Or it can be something more complex, like the machine learning-based analytics. Let's use the magic words AI, pixie dust, and can be something like that as well. But which one should I use? Should I use both? Should I use one and not use the other? What's the best approach here? Should I write more rules or policies depending on how your product calls this logic, or should I have less? Right? Kind of what is the right balance of how many, right, of these content pieces should I have on my SIEM? And how many alerts should I expect to see? I like to point to the SIEM as a funnel, right? And we normally, when you talk about scalability of a SIEM, we're usually talking about how throughput I have to ingest in all the telemetry that my environment will generate. But how much output I want? Ideally, I want 0, right? I don't want the SIEM to tell me anything unless there's really kind of a breach going on. But we know that the truth is not binary, right? Sometimes there is activity that I want to investigate, even if in the end it proves to be benign. So kind of how much output I want my SIEM to generate. And it is an interesting question because, again, right, the expected answer is 0 only when there are breaches. But we know that because it's very hard for the technology to be perfect and only tell you when there are actually breaches, we need to tune that funnel in a way that I would generate some output that has to be investigated by humans, but I cannot generate too much in a way that will overload my humans and eventually, right, can completely kind of fail on my security operation. So how do I answer all these questions? Since a few years ago, we started seeing some attempts to answer this question with more evidence-based studies. There was one 5 years ago by what was at the time was called Verodin, that is now part of Mandiant, on kind of some data that they were obtaining, right, kind of for the technology that they were kind of selling at that time. It was a breach and attack simulation tool, so they were testing certain environments, so generating kind of simulated attacks so they could see what the SIEM was producing. And there were some interesting findings there, like, for example, around 80 or 90% of the rules were never triggered. So you have a lot of content on that SIEM, but that content was never used. And why was that? What were the reasons? And they found a few reasons, like the rule was created and it was never tested. So you will never, what they call the dead on arrival. Right? The rule will never trigger just because it was written incorrectly. There have been changes in the environment, right? So someone upgraded, for example, a version of operating system, and the events that were supposed to be generated that will trigger the rule are not generated by their newer version. Or there is a firewall between the event data source and the SIEM, so the syslog messages are not getting through and reaching the SIEM. There are many reasons why those rules are not triggering, right? And those were things that were evaluated by this first kind of Verodin report from a few years ago. There are also a couple of reports from another small company called Cardinal Ops. They work on technology to really help organizations to improve the content, right, kind of and the practices around their SIEM. And they have produced a couple of very interesting reports also on what they are seeing in SIEMs out there. And again, that number, around 80 to 90% of rules that have never been triggered. And there is even an interesting number that they got on their report saying that only 16% of the MITRE attack techniques are covered by the content that they are seeing on SIEMs out there. It's pretty scary, right? If you think about kind of the 200 and something techniques out there that can be used as part of attacks, and you're only covering 16%, there is kind of, I would say, a reasonable assumption to say that those SIEMs are probably not prepared to identify an attack, right, if it happens. Now, there is some interesting data from those reports, but we wanted to do more, right? And Securonix, for those who do not know, our main product is a SIEM. It's a cloud SIEM, right? It's a cloud-based SIEM. And the advantage of having or running a cloud SIEM is that we can see a lot of data, right? It is, right, kind of by nature, a multi-tenant solution. So I have hundreds of customers. I can see the data, right, from all those customers and see how they are operating all their SIEMs, right? Kind of how many rules each instance of my SIEM is running. How many data sources each one of those is using. So I can see a lot of this type of information about the SIEM, so I can try to take a look at this data and try to derive some findings, some interesting pieces about how the SIEM is being used. And that was exactly what we did. We partnered with another organization called Scientia. For those that work on vulnerability management, if you saw those cool reports that these guys did together with Kena before they were acquired by Cisco, right? Kind of these are the same guys that do the the smart statistics and math part that actually kind of allow us to make sense from all this data. So we partner with them, we pick the data from our environment, we put it in their hands and say, let's try to figure out what's going on in this scene, in this multiple SIEM deployments, and try to see if we can find anything interesting here. So in particular, what we wanted to see, right, was, is there any kind of thing that we see here that indicates a best practice or indicate kind of a specific setup, a way of using the SIEM that can help us understanding, okay, if you have a SIEM, you should be doing this or that to get more value from it. Now, I'm going to go to some of the findings from that report, and after that, I want to try to extract some of the lessons. And the first thing that I will cover here is related to the data sources, right? The type of data that we're ingesting into our SIEM. And the interesting thing that we saw here was that only 7% of organizations have less than 7 data sources, right? So if anyone here has a SIEM with less than 7 data sources, know that you are in a kind of very small, right, group of organizations. Most likely, you're not seeing enough from your environment to derive any value from that tool. Now, there is a big group of organizations that are in a sweet spot. There is, one more click, there are between 7 and 17 data sources, excuse me. And that's kind of what we see most of the times. And the interesting thing when you see this number here is when I go back in some old research about which data sources you should be ingesting on the SIEM, this number of sources, they align more or less to the data sources that organizations will eventually try to ingest in the first or second wave of implementation that they will do on their SIEM. When we work at Gartner, we used to have conversations with organizations that will plan the deployment of SIEM, right? And they say, well, which sources should I bring to my SIEM? And I say, well, that's really kind of a hard to answer question. It depends on what you do with it, what you have in your environment. But these are the most common data sources that we usually see organizations doing. And that will usually be half of that, or probably kind of 2/3 of that list will be a first wave of kind of when organizations are deploying their SIEM, they will bring that in. Normally, they will go into a second, say, expansion project for the SIEM, try to bring more. I think that's kind of where they will reach that around 7 to 17 data sources, and after that, they break. Well, some, probably kind of many of them, kind of would happen, but kind of they normally would stay in that between 7 and 17 numbers. Some organizations will go pretty crazy here. They go over 30 different types of data sources. That's kind of probably kind of a different number from what we saw on those 2 reports from Cardinal Ops and Verodin. Some of those were mentioning more than 80 types of data sources. We didn't see that type of environment in our sample base. It's kind of a lot of variety of technologies in your organization. I wouldn't say that I wouldn't believe that an organization has more than 80 types of data sources, but it's certainly something very rare, something that we do not see often. There is also a question about how much data you should be ingesting on your SIEM. And there is kind of an interesting thing that we notice in terms of how much or how many events you ingest on your SIEM versus how many violations are generated. I have to put a big parenthesis here and a translation mode. When I say violation, is usually an alert. That violation is a term that is used within Securonix, and it may or may not be an alert. It is a result of a rule. I say that it may or may not be an alert because many times on a SIEM, the rule can be used as a building block for another rule. Right? Imagine you write a rule that if a certain condition, right, is present, you want to add a certain entity, a user or an IP address to a watch list. Right? You're not generating an alert, but the rule is triggered, and that condition, right, kind of that event, right, that action takes place. So it's not necessarily an alert, but the rule is working. For us, every time that the rule is performing an action is what we are calling a violation here. So what we are seeing is usually for every 10 events, we have 1 violation. So there is more or less kind of this ratio of 10. But an interesting thing that we saw in terms of how many violations we are generating is When we increase the number of violations that we generate, the number of alerts that the SOC is able to look at also is reduced. Now, there are two interpretations here, the full glass of water cup and the empty glass of water cup. The empty glass of water cup here is, I'm generating so many alerts, the SOC is going crazy, so they are being less able to look through all the alerts that are being generated. That may be the reality for many organizations. Now, there is another interpretation for this data piece here. If we are generating more violations, I may be generating more context to generate alerts. So with more violations, I have more building blocks that can be used to generate a smaller number of alerts. So in that case, more violations is good. So kind of the conclusion here, it's a very long piece of story to tell you, well, we're not 100% sure about what's going on here, because I don't know if the case here is because the SOC is being overloaded. I suspect that's not the case, because otherwise I wouldn't have an adjudicator kind of alerts kind of falling that much. It would be probably stable over kind of the number of violations. Or the good interpretation that I believe is more likely is that we are being able to generate alerts with more context, so there are less need to go through unnecessary or alerts that lack context. Now, going back to that question in terms of which data sources, right? That was a very common question in Gartner Times, people calling, I'm deploying my SIEM, which data sources should I bring in? And when you're looking at the data from my environment, kind of from my customers, it's impressive how this is close to what we are writing, just kind of from, let's say, anecdotal data, right? Kind of from customers saying, oh, I'm bringing data into my SIEM from network stuff, from authentication, from Windows, from endpoint security. We see those, right? Kind of majority of organizations are actually ingesting those data sources. So if you are putting in a SIEM and you're trying to define the first batch of data sources, most likely you're going to have these first 7 or 8 sources here. That's probably the most common sources out there for everyone. I like to also look at the bottom, because we see a few things that are very unusual. So for example, physical access. There's a lot of people saying, or kind of SIEM vendors saying, see how cool, we can look at the badge, right, that you are using at the office of at the door of the office, and we can correlate that with your authentication. So if you're authenticating from remotely, and we correlate that with your badge and you're in the office, we're gonna kind of tell you that, of course, that's true, that the SIEM is kind of very capable of doing that. How many organizations are ingesting the data that makes that possible? Almost no one. Another thing that I like to point here is databases and applications. We very often see organizations planning to do that early in the deployment stage, but still, we don't see many doing it, just 1 in 5, more or less. And why is that? Because usually it's something challenging to do on the source side, not necessarily on the SIEM, but I'm going to ingest all the logs from my application, and what happens? You realize that the application doesn't generate logs. Or it generates logs that are so hard to comprehend that you give up. Or you go to the DBA to ask for the logs from the database, and they say, we will not turn on those logs because it's going to crash my database. So there are kind of many reasons why we end up seeing organizations giving up or ingesting those data sources, and the data just shows us that they're really kind of still not very popular. Now, there is another interesting analysis to do with these data sources. Which ones are the most noisy ones? So which data sources are giving me the highest percentage of what we call non-concerning alerts? So for every alert that is being generated based on this data source, right, what's the percentage of those that are non-concerning? And we see the endpoint security, it is kind of very noisy. It generates a lot of stuff that ends up being confirmed as non-concerning. And same thing for network security, like the IDSs and IPSs of the world. And here, I like to point to applications. How many, right, kind of the alerts being generated by applications are actually false positives? Not that many, right? So it may be something that we don't see organizations ingesting very often, but it may be very valuable because it's not something that generates a lot of false positives. So this is something and sometimes you end up seeing organizations rushing to get their firewall logs, for example, into the SIEM, but it takes them a lot of time to get data from their proxy. Now compare, right, the amount of non-concerning alerts from the network stuff versus the proxy. So there are some trade-offs, right, that we should look at when you're planning which data sources to bring into the SIEM that we can make based on the data that we can see here. And when we look at all this data, probably the next question is, okay, cut to the chase and tell me, what is the perfect source? What is the perfect data source? Unfortunately, it's not there. What is this chart? What is this chart here? Here on the vertical, I show how many of these alerts are actually true, right? When they were generated, someone look at those and say, whoa, this is really bad, right? It's a source of concern. And on the horizontal axis is how many violations I'm generating. So how chatty this data source is. So ideally, I would have things that are what? On the top left side, and I have to use my right hand when I do this. It's very confusing, but I should have sources, or the perfect sources, on that blank empty circle over there, right? So it was sources that almost don't generate violations, but when they do, right, I'm almost certain that they are related to something bad. And there are not many there. Right? So we see, sometimes you see things that are really high in terms of concern. Remember I was mentioning applications, but at the same time, they may be a bit chatty, right? They generate a lot of violations. Or we look at the content management stuff. It's a really chatty source, because normally every time that someone touches a data piece in your organization, a record will be generated. Right? But if you build content, if you build rules based on that, it's a pretty decent level of concern that you get from those data sources. And so we see that direction, right, upwards to the left is where I should see the best or the more interesting data sources because of the cost benefit I will get from them. So how do I normally select these data sources? Before looking at all this data, I would say, let's take a step back and let's remember our use cases. What do I want to use this for? And why this is important? Because so far, I'm talking about looking into threat detection. I'm trying to find bad stuff. And many times, you decide to ingest data not because you want to detect bad stuff, but because someone told you to do that. The old compliance case, we still have, right? The SIEM case, the SIEM solution being used not for threat detection, but as a log management solution primarily, or just retain audit records for most of the time. So trying to understand first what you want to do with that piece of data, it's an important driver of the decision. Sometimes you have a data source that is not very valuable from a threat detection perspective, but you're required to do so for other reasons. So you may have to do this balance between what you're required to do versus what you want to do for threat detection. And here, it's one of the examples, right? There is data from MITRE, for example, related to the MITRE ATT&CK framework, where for each technique from the MITRE ATT&CK framework, you have the desired data sources you should have in place to detect those techniques being used in your environment, right? So that's say the threat detection point of view. Here, the compliance-oriented point of view. What do you want to use this data for? What is your use case? Now, when I have my SIEM in place, I decided which data sources. The next question will be from the data that I will, or the rules, the content that I will create on this SIEM. Should I create more rules? Should I create less rules? Should I bring all those out-of-the-box rules that the vendor provides me and enable all of them? Right? What's going to happen? Or should I disable everything and just use a handful of rules? Well, we were able to find a correlation between the number of violations generated by the SIEM and the amount of rules that you have enabled. Right? So you see here, as the number of policies grow, you have, for every two rules, right, or every time that you double the number of policies, you have 6 times more violations being generated. It is important to pay attention to this ratio here, because that will eventually affect you in terms of sizing of your environment, right? If you are looking at that bill from my competitor that is famous for how expensive they are in gigabytes per second, and you're trying to run away from that, you need to pay attention, right? As you start putting more rules, you're going to generate more data. I'm being unfair with them because this is not about events ingested, it's about events generated. But this will affect primarily your SOC, your analysts. You start creating a lot of policies because you want to cover all the MITRE ATT&CK framework. I wanted to have a rule for each technique on the framework. Now you're generating a lot of things that may overflow your analysts when they're trying to triage all that stuff, right? So you double the number of policies you have. Now you have 6 times more violations being generated. So you need to be very careful in terms of how much content you're adding to your SIEM. Now, what about the relationship between the number of rules you have, policies, content, and the amount of data that you have in your SIEM? There is also a relationship where we see that for every 6, 7 data sources, more or less, that you're adding, you double the number of policies. And here is an interesting number that it differs from what I saw from the other previous surveys, because on some of them, they weren't able to find this relationship, this correlation between the number of data sources you have and the number of rules on the SIEM. And they were saying that the vendors were not providing enough content. Was the rationale for that non-existence of correlation on those cases? Here I'm looking at only one vendor, that is Securonix, so it may be biased. Right, on our case, it's very rarely to have a data source that we do not have content for. So this may just be a natural correlation from kind of the amount of rules that I have that I can provide to my customers per data source, right? But anyway, the customers are using those policies, so it's a clear indication that as they add data sources, they also increase the number of policies on the system. Wrong button. Let's go there. So and I've been saying here policies or rules, but it's important to mention, right, as I said in the beginning, that SIEMs today are not only about rules. They have different types of content. And on my content, on my platform, I have some different classifications, right? Analytics, when I have some more advanced type of statistics and time machine learning being used from a simple rule, right? Kind of rule is normally going to have kind of a regular expression, a Boolean logic there. Threat intel, I'm having kind of a direct comparison with threat intel sources. I'm looking for IOCs, for example. I may have a combination of analytics and rule, and I may have a rule that is essentially looking for enriched data in that event. What is enriched data? I may be looking, for example, to trigger every time that I see a certain activity from a user or an employee from a certain department. Do I have that department on the event? No, I do not have that information. The event is being ingested on my platform. I am enriching that event with additional information, and this rule or this policy here is looking at that enriched data. And when I look at what I have in these organizations, I see that the simplest type of content, either kind of the machine learning models that are pre-built, or the rules that are pre-built, the comparison with threat intel, they are kind of probably almost always used. But when you look at enrichment, it already falls. It's still kind of a little more than half of my customers. It's not as much as those others. Why? Because if I want to use rules that will look at enriched data, I need to have enriched data in the first place. Right? So if I want to look at the department of the users, I need to have that information being ingested by the SIEM. And some organizations may not be mature enough to have enriched data on their platforms to use enriched, that will use policies that look for enriched content. So that kind of is a very easy explanation about why we see this drop. And we see that even more when you look at custom type of content, right? The customer is writing their own content instead of just relying on content that is produced by Securonix. You see how much that falls, right? They may not have the ability, they may not have the skills to write that content. There is another interesting view that we do with these types of content is for each data source that I have, what type of content I'm using. And we're going to see, I'm sorry, this may be too small here, that when I look at Windows or endpoint security or cloud security, it's very common to have analytics applied. Those are normally kind of very chatty data sources. So when I have a lot of data, I can start applying things like anomaly detection, behavioral profiling. If you think, for example, endpoint security, many EDR tools will generate process information, right? Which processes are being run right, are running on my endpoints. So I can start looking, for example, for never before seen processes. And I start applying that type of analytics on those events. While on the other hand, I have rules, for example, being used in kind of some older technologies or kind of more understanded technologies like Linux or Unix. We know kind of what we want to see on the events from those platforms. Email as well is something where we kind of very frequently see rules because I know what type of content I'm looking for. I can be more precise about the type of content that I'm looking for. Now, I think this view is more interesting when we are trying to do this correlation between the analytics and the data source. Because here, I'm using that old view that we saw in terms of the concern rate versus how many violations I generate, and then I apply different techniques for each data source. And you're going to find some very interesting differences here. Like, look at Windows. When you just use rules, not only you have more violations being generated, but they're also less meaningful. When you start applying analytics, it really kind of grows in value, but also you have a less chatty result. On the other hand, when you look at authentication and access, when I just use analytics, it's really on the bottom of value, but when I use rules, it goes higher. There may be some odd explanations here. My hypothesis for this case is a lot related to how mature organizations are with their processes around authentication and access. Think, for example, if someone is using the administrator built-in account in Windows, right? Less mature organizations, right, can have more problems with that. But if you are kind of a mature organization, you can write a rule that is very specific. If you see administrator logged in, generate an alert, because that shouldn't happen at all in my environment, right? So that's a rule. It's very simple, right? But normally kind of the level of concern will be quite high when that happens. So kind of some of this, I think the threat intel part is also very interesting. We see some organizations trying to use threat intel for the network telemetry, and you see kind of the value down there. But when they apply threat intel to the proxy, right, when I have full URLs, for example, it's far more valuable. So those are kind of many things that we see these differences in value according to the technique that you're using versus the data source that you're ingesting. We looked a lot in terms of kind of the techniques, the data sources, but there's also something that I think it's very important. It's very aligned to what we saw from the other studies as well. It's related to the tuning of the environment, right? There's no SIEM that doesn't require tuning at all, right? You need to do some adjustment on the content that you have there, especially because when you look at what you have there, normally 80% of your rules are the other side, 20% of your policies or rules are responsible for 80% of the alerts, right? They are the one that are more frequently activated. But not only that, 20% of the policies are responsible for 85% of the non-concerning alerts. So those alerts that you don't care about, either they are false positives or they shouldn't be triggered in any way because you don't care about that condition. So you see how a small amount of tuning can do a dramatic difference in your environment, right? Because there are really kind of a small universe of rules that are generating noise for you. And this is kind of even more easier to understand when you look at the funnel of policies, right? When you think of all the policies that we have across all the environments kind of from our data set, right? 89%, so 90% of the rules had never been triggered. They never generated a single violation. They're just there waiting. Sometimes that's bad because, right, kind of it's just kind of a toil that you have in your environment. You don't know if that's kind of useful or not. You have to review, so you're spending time and resources with that. But sometimes you're just covering for a situation, right, that shouldn't happen anyway, and you want to be covered. Now, for every violation that you generate, right, there will be cases that will never be will turn out to be an alert. And for those things that are generated as alerts, only 1% of those, right, are defined as a concern. So you see how the policies and you start seeing the number of policies you have. A huge amount of them will never generate a violation. Some of them will generate a violation, but you never turn into the alert. And the alerts kind of for many of those, we'll never kind of, only a small number of those will be considered a concerning alert. So you see how things are following the funnel of the SIEM from the huge amounts of data and policies to the small number of alerts. So after looking at all this data, can we derive conclusions? And I grouped the conclusions across kind of some of the things that I cover here. And the first is on the data sources. Again, most organizations between 7 and 17. Why kind of staying around that boundary? Fewer data sources, you don't have much signals, you won't find anything. Too many data sources, too noisy, too much to spend, right, to be able to ingest all that telemetry. So normally kind of staying around these numbers, it makes sense from kind of a cost-benefit perspective. Which data sources? It really depends on your use cases, but there are some data sources that really look like must-have. So some endpoint telemetry, the Active Directory, identity and access management systems, the web, your web infrastructure, right? If you have web servers facing the internet, WAF, the data, right? The telemetry from your cloud providers, email, proxy, content filtering, secure web gateway, whatever you want to call that. Content management, cloud apps, I think kind of those are the ones that we see as probably the biggest bang for the buck. But again, depends on kind of particulars from your organization. This is most likely to be true for most of you, but there will be some variation. Techniques and policies, right? Kind of the rules. Each type of threat and data source require a type of content. That's another thing to keep in mind. Do not approach your SIEM with that idea that I will only use machine learning because rules are old. No, we saw some cases, we saw the data showing that for some types of content, it's better to use rules than analytics. For some use cases, it's better to use rules than analytics. So kind of keep in mind that the right content really depends on what type of data and conditions that you're looking for. Matching proxy and network traffic with threat intel, more the proxy than network traffic. We saw the proxy is more valuable. Windows events are normally kind of better to use analytics because of kind of how verbose they are, and normally kind of help you with the finding anomalies through all those events. Just repeating here, simple rules are still useful for certain situations. When you look at the applications, for example, we saw the applications were using rules very commonly. And why is that? Because when you have your custom application, your business application, it's very common to know exactly what you're looking for. Right? Oh, I want to ingest data from my application because if I see my application being used in this and that way, it is a source of concern. So normally we know very well what we want to look into application logs. So it's a natural situation to see common rules being used for application logs. And when you're writing all that content, just be careful to not overload the team that will handle with the output from these rules. Keep in mind that radio, 2 times the content, 6 times the output. From your overall management of the environment point of view, reviewing and tuning the content is key for multiple reasons, right? Because a small number of policies, as we saw in the data, can generate a huge amount of noise, right? So you have to apply a little tuning so you can get most value from the SIEM. A lot of content is never triggered, so if you can get rid of those that really kind of shouldn't even be there in first place, you also will free resources, you have kind of environment that is leaner, is easier to use. But again, keeping the 2 to 6 radio in mind, right? Because if the rule is not valuable enough, it's probably a better idea to not have it at all. But keep in mind as well that writing rules that can be, or content that can be used as building blocks, things that will together be used as a justification to generate an alert, is also a good practice, because when I have more building blocks, I have the ability to generate less alerts and with more context as well. So if I try to answer, right, the initial question, what works for SIEM, I say the right mix of data sources, but not too many because of the noise again. The right content, using the right analytics and the approaches for each use case. Keep the content base clean, kind of keep tuning it as necessary. And something that I haven't covered in the data, but it's a practice that is becoming more common. don't forget to test it. Use kind of breach and attack simulation, red atomic team, atomic red team, I'm always mangling kind of their acronym. Right, we need to keep running simulations and seeing what happens with our SIEM, what type of alerts are being generated. It helps you validate the rules that are never triggered, the rules that are never triggering because your data source is misconfigured. Kind of, it'll help you validating that the SIEM is actually kind of set up as it should be. And again, it's the only node to know that it's working. You do not want to learn that it's not working after you're breached. So with that, and with exactly 5 minutes for question, I want to thank you all for being here. And please bring questions. Thank you. Silence. I'm going to have to bribe people with cookies. We want cookies as speakers, you know.
Questions?
So the last bit about the quiet rules really got stuck in my head, right? So how do you tell the bad rule, quiet because bad, from quiet because the threat never happened? What's the shortest, easiest way to tell quiet bad from quiet good?
I think that's why you probably need to review it, right? To have a process to look at them. If you do, for example, you run the first time, you're going to find, okay, all these rules here have never been triggered. You may have the ability to do some kind of fast analysis in certain metadata from the rules to see, oh, this rule needs these data sources, right? And these data sources are disabled, right? So it's very easy for you to figure that out. But for those, if the data source is there, right, you're going to have to investigate why, right? So for example, using the test tools, okay, let's trigger it, kind of what happened. We're going to have to run a search manually to see if the data is coming. Is that kind of problem on the data source? So I think that the bad news here is the first time you do it, it's painful. But once you do the first wave of cleaning, if you start doing that regularly, it's easier. Oh, cool.
Yeah, I'm interested in you had the list of data sources. We've gone through this cycle of, what do we bring in, what we don't bring in. And I think there's some data sources like IPS, which I didn't see on the list, right? And we had, when we went through all of those things, it was like 99% false positive, so we basically took it out, right? But I'm also interested when you're talking about the perfect data source. We have, since we used a particular EDR, right, and we have actually switched over the years, it does look like this new EDR that we're doing has been almost, from our point of view, almost being like that perfect data source, right? It's been very clean, it hasn't generated a lot of noise, and we've had good luck with it, right? So I'm wondering, is that unusual? Because in your list here, I see your endpoint security as being generating a fair amount of noise based on your initial graph, right? So any comments on that?
Yes, and let me just see here, because I think I have one slide that has some interesting data. Yeah, so what happens here is sometimes you have differences in terms of what an endpoint security source is versus, for example, an operating system. There's first that difference, right? You can get data directly from Windows versus from an EDR tool. And when you get from EDR, you may have the alerts from the EDR tool versus the more granular data the EDR tool can provide, right? So you may end up finding yourself in a situation where you will get an EDR tool that generates a lot of granular data that you will feed into your SIEM. You have more data, and if you look into these individual events as their value as single alerts, a one-to-one relationship, it may be very low, right? Because it's generating a lot of telemetry. Now, you will have low value, those events as an alert themselves, but they are very good as an input for things that you may want to write on your SIEM. Right? So for example, I have analytics for an endpoint that looks at process data, right? So if there is a process that I never seen before, right, I can trigger a violation to increase the risk for that specific endpoint, for example, right? If I get an EDR that only generates alerts, I won't have the telemetry to do that, right? Well, that EDR can do that on its own, right? So what I'm doing is I'm actually I'm outsourcing the detection of that specific condition to the EDR tool and not to the SIEM, right? And I would say, as long as you do that in a constant manner, that you're actually doing that, that's okay, right? I think important, and I think that's one of the reasons why it's important to test, right? Because you may, when you decide to go to the EDR tool that generates better alerts but less telemetry, you may do that in a way that you generate less data to your SIEM. So you reduce the load, but you're offloading the endpoint-based detection to the EDR tool. Then I say, ideal condition is run the test, right? Kind of the automated tests before you do the change, and then run after, and then you can compare. You may find exactly the same conditions, but now certain conditions are being triggered by the EDR tool, and you use that alert as a building block on the SIEM. Or you're not finding things on EDR and finding everything on the SIEM. Both work. It really depends on what you prefer, right? There are people that may want more data, more telemetry on the SIEM because they want more ability to write their own content, for example.
Yeah, sorry, just to add to that. Yeah, so you're absolutely right. Like we have basically outsourced a lot of the alerts from the endpoints to the EDR, right? But at the same time, we do pull in all the telemetry from the EDR into the SIEM, where we add on our additional rules based on, let's say, what we discover through, Mandiant secure validation thing, right? So as we find more and more threats, we're adding just more and more stuff from the telemetry that we get, but relying mostly on the existing alerts coming from the EDR. You're right.
Right. That's another kind of interesting point, right? So if you need, for example, to do retrospective analysis of the data for looking for IOCs that you're only getting now, but you want to look the last 3 weeks of data. If your EDR tool doesn't support keeping all that, the more granular telemetry for that long, you may want to ingest that on the SIEM, that will allow you to do that kind of retrospective analysis. Yep. Is that a question? No. All right, I think we are done with the time. So thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of the day and rest of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Augusto.